Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I am Maria DeStore, and I'm the Executive Director of the Scleroderma Foundation's Rocky Mountain chapter. And I'm here today with Dr. Todd Bull. He is the Director of Pulmonary Vascular Diseases and the Center for Lungs and Breathing at UCHealth. He's also served many years on the Rocky Mountain chapter's Medical Advisory Board, and many of you have had the pleasure of meeting him at some of our education events. It's a big year for the Rocky Mountain chapter. We are celebrating 20 years of service in the scleroderma community. And to mark this occasion, we have launched the Imagine campaign in an effort to raise $100,000 in 2021 to launch the Rocky Mountain chapter into the future. 1/3 of all the funds raised will be donated to research, the Scleroderma Foundation's research grant program. I'm here today with Dr. Bull because he is a past recipient of one of these grants, a new investigator grant. And we just wanted to hear from him a little bit about what it means as a young researcher to be funded and what some of the work he does at UCHealth.
Well, perfect. Thanks, Maria, so much for inviting me to be on this live Facebook event and the opportunity to talk a little bit about both the importance of research funding and investigative work in the field of medical science, and then also how it related to me specifically. I can tell you, going back to your sort of original question, which was, how was this important, or how did this impact me as a young investigator? I can tell you that really this was a pivotal award in a critical aspect of my career development. And just so I think people have an understanding of how this works in academic medicine, is that once you've completed your various aspects of training and decide that you're going to be in an academic type role, that is at a university setting or something along those lines, one of the potential paths or career paths that you can opt for in that direction is an investigative or research path. And so, in my particular case, I always love being a doctor then. I love being a doctor now, and I love seeing patients as one of my primary functions. But I also love the idea of trying to come up with new ways or new ideas about how we can care for patients better, better care for health, come up with better ideas on diagnostic approaches, just overall try to forward medical science, which is such a critical aspect of what we of evolving in medicine and improving how patients live, thrive, and survive, if you will, is sort of the lingo of the NIH. And so this particular award came to me actually it was a while ago now, because I was, quote, a young investigator, and I'm no longer that. But it came at a critical time in my career when I was looking for research funding, things that would allow me to stay in an academic direction. But to do research, you need to be funded to do the research, and this particular award was identified for again, young investigators, so people setting off in their career, didn't have a large track record of publications, but really what they were looking for was someone who had some potential to do work. That's when we're searching for young investigators, do we have a good environment? Meaning, are there others around me that could sort of assist me to get the work done? And there were. And is the idea meritorious? So what is it you're investigating? Does it have the potential to sort of lead to further awards and studies down the road? And so again, this was an award early in my career, came at a very fortuitous time where I needed some funding to help with my laboratory, get it up and established. It really helped me get some very important preliminary data that we went on to use in some other awards down the road, which were then bigger grants, and resulted in publications. And still to this day, I have some research ideas that came out of that particular award at that time in my career. So really, I consider these Young Investigator Awards, which foundations like the Scleroderma Foundation are really very adept at delivering. They're don't tend to be huge dollar amounts. I mean, they're significant for a young investigator. They're not the $1 million awards of the more senior investigators, but they're enough to kind of get some preliminary data going, help a career get started. And these, in my mind, are essential awards for individuals early on in their careers.
Awesome. And I think you looked at genetic mutations. How do genetic mutations play in with scleroderma research?
Yeah, and so that specific award at that time, we were looking at what we would call gene expression analysis. And it wasn't as much as we were looking at specific genetic mutations, but at that time, we had a relatively new platform for investigation, which were called high throughput analyses. And what that specific award was looking at is and this is something that I've been very interested in my career and still am to this today, is trying to do what we call translational science, where we look to the patient to sort of say, hey, is there a sample that we can take from the patient? In this particular case, it was blood, to then try to inform about the disease itself, scleroderma in this case. And so one of the things that I was interested in, still am interested in now, are things we call biomarkers, if you will. So markers in this case in blood that we could use to sort of identify patients with in this case, scleroderma. And in my interest, so I'm a pulmonary and critical care physician, and I'm in our cardiology division. I'm interested in pulmonary hypertension or pulmonary vascular disease from an investigative standpoint. And so we were trying to use peripheral blood and then gene expression of the cells in the peripheral blood to identify patients with scleroderma who might then be at risk for developing pulmonary hypertension, so a disease state within scleroderma. And that's important because it's two aspects of that that are important. I mean, scleroderma is a population that we know are at risk for pulmonary hypertension. So other diseases with that people that get pulmonary hypertension, we don't always know that that particular person is at high risk for it. For example, idiopathic or primary pulmonary hypertension, there's no good way to screen. But in scleroderma, we know that, somewhere up to maybe as high as 20% of patients with systemic sclerosis or limited scleroderma are at risk for developing pulmonary hypertension. And so our thought was, if we drew blood and looked at the genes in the cells within the blood, that perhaps we can identify a signature, if you will, that would be indicative of developing it. And we were able to parse out some gene expression that was differentially expressed between patients that had scleroderma PH and those who had scleroderma without PH, and then went on to publish on that and are still trying to refine that at this time, though a number of other labs and actually now some bigger grants are sort of running with that concept as well, trying, again, to try to figure out who's at risk for developing it, because we think, in fact, we know from earlier studies that the earlier we catch it and the sooner we treat it, the better patients do in the long run. So.
Great. And so what do we need to do next? How do we get towards finding a cure for fibrosis and scleroderma? What do we need to do?
Yeah, so that's an open-ended question there at this point, but it's there's obviously a lot to do, especially when one is talking about cure or even importantly appropriate management. I mean, there are numerous diseases out there that we don't per se cure, but that we manage very effectively. And a nice example of that is the work that was done on HIV. Where HIV was sort of universally fatal, but with appropriate resources and research put into it, people can now live with HIV and have very normal lives, longevity-wise, and things along those lines. And it really is an example of when resources are put towards a condition or a disease such as that, really the power of investigative work and how we can change, how people do what was, initially essentially a death sentence turned into just now a condition that you live with and can live with, for those, for a normal period of time. Systemic hypertension, an example, we have lots of medications that we use to manage high blood pressure. Do we cure high blood pressure? No, if you came off the medications, then there'd be an issue, but we manage it down. And we have, a very direct example of this right now, which we're all dealing with this pandemic. Really the remarkable speed at which science can move when given appropriate resources and appropriate motivation. We went from knowing nothing about this virus a year ago to having very effective treatments, now 3 different FDA-approved vaccines in just an incredible short period of time. So let's take that as an analogy to the importance of then funding research in diseases like scleroderma and pulmonary hypertension associated with scleroderma, things along those lines. And so, with which kind of gets at to, I think, the point you want to make for these fundraisings. It's these are the opportunities where we really, we put resources to this, and Scleroderma Foundation being, the sort of place that could, harness resources and then divvy them out to investigators to kind of make headway. We can move forward and make significant inroads. Now, from my perspective, everyone has their own bias about where that money should be spent. I've already sort of listed my interests in trying to identify at-risk individuals, with the idea that if we could figure out, by looking at someone's blood, for example, or some other surrogate marker, that with scleroderma, 2 years from now, you are at risk for developing pulmonary hypertension, then we could intervene earlier, perhaps. The other critical aspect of that, so that's early identification of those at risk. But when we get at, and you mentioned, cure again, or in my mind, management, it really is kind of getting at what the pathophysiology or pathobiology, why does it happen in the first place? Why does pulmonary hypertension occur in scleroderma? And that's not really well understood. We have some ideas about it. We've learned a lot from other disease states of where scleroderma or where you get pulmonary hypertension. And there are about 8 or 9 diseases that result in pulmonary hypertension that's similar to what you get in scleroderma. They're all very different diseases, and so that should be in fact, it is a huge clue to us that there's some pathway that's become abnormal in all these different disease states that's causing this change in the pulmonary arteries and the pulmonary vasculature, which then causes the right heart failure. So really trying to unwind, if you will, or figure out where that pathophysiology, what that common pathway is important. And we're on that. There are many labs that are on that path, looking for those clues here. And I think the gene expression aspect of it that my lab has been involved with is one way of trying to get at that. But other very important ways are, modeling, so animal models to human modeling of cells in the lab, and the much more bench work, if you will. We refer to bench science, which is sort of away from the patient, but into the laboratory. So.
Awesome. And so lastly, the Scleroderma Foundation just announced a new pre-doctoral summer fellowship award program. Why is this important? What is this? Why is the Scleroderma Foundation doing this, do you think? Yeah,
I think it's great. And I agree. It's an incredibly important approach. And in particular for societies like this, because it's this, it's in a pre-doctoral, meaning, so these are candidates that have not received either their PhD or MD, or kind of working their way towards that. But it's a way to really kind of attract talent and interest to the field that you're trying to promote. So in this case, in scleroderma, you would like to find, or we would like to find, the best minds out there who sort of say, hey, how can I turn my talents, early on in my career towards really improving again how people do in the long time. And so it's these sort of early awards that again, foundations like the Scleroderma Foundation are very adept at sort of putting together and then identifying good candidates for, and can really can kind of guide what someone's career path is. Once you start and have an award like this, and research awards, quite frankly, are very difficult to come by. It's not that it's a very small percentage of people that apply for these get them. It's in the usually less than 10% range that that these are funded at. That is, and so you really do when you're able to, as a pre-doctoral candidate or a postdoctoral candidate or young investigator or even an investigator, or have award to this, like, well, then you say, okay, my efforts and direction will be towards this. And towards these questions you're trying to answer. So I think it's important. It's important to support careers in science, so that people stay on these pathways, because this is ultimately how we will impact people positively in the long run. And secondly, again, it's a good idea for societies like Scleroderma to kind of, if you will, find people that can then direct their careers in this direction, if you will. So.
Well, thank you so much for Dr. Bull for helping us understand a little bit behind the scenes of scleroderma research. Please, everyone, you hear why it's important, you hear what we need. Please think about donating to the Imagine campaign. Our Scleroderma Foundation Rocky Mountain Chapter Board has offered to match up to $8,000 of donations to the Imagine campaign in the month of March. So your donation will be double the impact. Help us take these steps towards a cure. Thank you for participating. Thank you, Dr. Bull, for being with us today. And tomorrow afternoon at, I think it's 4 o'clock Mountain, we'll be interviewing another researcher for another perspective on this. So thank you for joining us. Have a great day, Dr. Bull.
Well, thank you, Maria. Thank you so much for allowing me to participate, and thank to everyone for signing on. And again, it's been my great honor to participate with such a great foundation, the Scleroderma Foundation, and I'll say a belated thank you all for funding my research years ago and getting me on this pathway.